LeadersIn is delighted to be here at the CMO Exchange, and today we've got Markus Kramer with us, the Global Marketing Director for Aston Martin. Prior to that, he was also involved in the marketing over at Harley-Davidson, so he knows a thing or two about very cool brands. We're delighted to have Markus here with us today. Markus, welcome.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Markus, we usually start just with a few personal things, just getting to know our guest if we can. So, first of all, do you live near the Aston Martin HQ?
I do indeed. I live in Oxford, and Gaydon is up in Warwickshire. And of course, you can hear from my accent that I'm not particularly from the British Midlands, but that's where we are based. It's about 40 minutes north of where I live, and then Heathrow is around the corner as well. Helps.
Okay, good. Yeah. And where are you from originally?
Switzerland.
I could have guessed that. I didn't want to do it. And do you drive an Aston or a Harley-Davidson?
Well, let me answer the second one first. I don't drive a Harley anymore. I've got 3 young children, a very busy life, and I do drive an Aston. So the space for Harley is naturally limited as it stands.
Excellent. And one that everybody would want to know is, do you get a staff discount if you're working for for Aston Martin? Do you get?
No, we don't do discounts.
You don't do discounts?
No, we don't do discounts.
Okay, excellent. It's Aston Martin. Good. If we can talk about the brand. As I mentioned in the introduction, you've worked with Aston Martin, obviously an iconic brand, and also Harley-Davidson, which has got cult following around the world. So if you can tell us in a sort of a nutshell, what do you think is the art of building a great brand?
Wow, really big question. But if I could sum it up, I think it's definitely innovation, passion, and time. If you take the 3 together, you get a really, really good mix. Some brands like Harley or like Aston, they do have a long heritage and long history that clearly helps. But passion and innovation also springs off in more recent brands, and we can clearly see good examples in the technology sector. But in the high-end luxury brand sector, for instance, you rarely get around the long-standing history and the anchor in really rich history as a context.
Yeah, perfect. Philip Kotler, the US marketing guru, he says that to create a cult following or cult brand is less about the marketing activity; it's more about the people that are talking about your product. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I can definitely see the point, and I think we really have to distance ourselves from just the marketing terminology, because if you think of the human needs that really drive emotion, passion is the common denominator. And if you've got something at the core, like Harley does, for instance, that is extremely built around a passion, and Aston does the same thing, then you model your mix and your company and your structure and your marketing elements around that. But at the very core of it, you've got to have a human ingredient. In my opinion, it evolves around passion. Same for luxury goods very often. That allows you to drive a cult or build a following or build a cult where people can share. It's not too different from what we see in the digital space and the whole social networks. Harley-Davidson, for instance. Social networks started with the Harley Owners Group in the early 80s. Yeah, computers weren't even on the radar screen. It's incredibly powerful. So if you do have a passion grain at some point that you structure around it, that is what allows you to build a cult.
Excellent. And how difficult is it? I know that Aston Martin, or I imagine Aston Martin, is very careful about where you put your brand, your logo, and everything else, because it is, it's Aston Martin. But increasingly we hear that with CMOs and brands, they're sort of almost losing control over the ability to manage that brand, because the consumers at the end of the day are sort of having more of a say because of social media and everything else. And so how is that sort of play with you and Aston Martin in the sense that there's been a shift of power, if you like, to consumers talking about your brand?
We really have to differentiate here, because if you look at brand building activities, for instance, in emerging markets, it doesn't necessarily play to your disadvantage if you want to build awareness very quickly. However, in more established markets, for instance, I take the Western world for our brand, and the UK in particular, of course, we're extremely careful about how we use and apply our brands. And we've got very rigid control mechanisms around that. When we move east, it's slightly different. We're probably slightly more relaxed about it, because it is about building awareness relatively quickly. And then the second point on this is, the power is with the consumer. You Google Aston Martin, you look at the logo, there's not much you can actually do other than be completely consistent and persistent through the various channels that you employ. Make it so cool that people actually want to use the latest and greatest.
Yeah. Talking about cool, and you mentioned emerging markets there, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit later in this interview about emerging markets and your strategy in some of those high growth areas. But if I can, you mentioned cool as well. So James Bond and the whole Bond campaign and Bond being inextricably linked to Aston Martin, is that a very important association for you from sort of a marketing perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I would lie if I would say no. Of course it is. It absolutely is. Because, again, you've got to go back to the real core of what the brand stands for. It's not so much about what the brand does or what it is, but who it is as a personality or as a character. And if you look at the personalities such as James Bond, well, it's spot on, right? He's a gentleman. He can be a rogue if he wants to. He's sort of the brute in a suit. He has everything that people aspire to. Yet he's a fictitious character. He's completely timeless. And we really started in 1964 with James Bond and built this constant love affair over many, many years, decades even. Yeah. And timeless values of what James Bond stands for, and I would even argue of what we stand for, not to us as in consequence of what James Bond does for us, is incredibly important. Right back to the very core values of what James Bond actually represents. So we're his brand of choice. It's not because we've said, here's so much money and here we're going to do product placement. We've never done that. But we're his brand of choice. And as such, we behave in everything we do in product placement, not just James Bond, equally as such. We don't pay for product placements, for instance.
Oh, really? So you're not paying the MGM or whoever the studios are for? Oh.
No, we don't. We're not in the game of paying big bucks for placing our, I'm not going to name any competitive brands, of course, our cars into it. No.
Yeah. But I suppose I can. I suppose it doesn't really make sense for Bond to be driving a Skoda, for example. Or
of course it wouldn't. Of course it wouldn't.
So
we wouldn't like it either. Of course.
That's right.
Of course.
I think people would start going off Bond because he's got a brand at the end of the day as well. Yeah. If we can talk about economic markets, I mean, you've as you said, you're very, very well known in the UK. You're well known elsewhere as well. But I imagine there's other priority markets for you. Is that a strategic priority for you at Aston Martin to really make sure your brand is now exported, if you like?
It is, absolutely. And that's where the growth of the company will come from, I'm convinced. If you walk out the streets here, where we are here in London, and ask any male, 30 years old, 40 years old, you name it, they will not only know who we are, they will also know what the DB9 is, the DBS is, the V8 Vantage is, and the differences between. You do the same thing in the US, so we're still in the Western developed world, and you get Aston Martin, do they still build cars? Oh, James Bond. So it's very difficult to break through the surface of deeper brand understanding the farther away we go from the UK. You take these two emerging markets such as Russia or China, for instance, and people can't distinguish it from a bar of soap. It's hence very, very, very important for us to build brand awareness and with it brand equity as quickly as we possibly can. So those are the strategic growth market for us, absolutely.
Yeah. Everyone's talking about, and I know you're very active in the Far East and in China, for example, there's been an estimated last year 111 billion yuan spent on luxury goods, according to Bain & Co. So everyone's talking about the hype in the Far East. Do you think for Aston Martin that that's important and more so than, for example, further growth in the US? Do you think the US has sort of had its day like potentially the rest of the Western world?
Again, last question first. I don't think the US had its days. Absolutely not. And particularly not for Aston Martin. We're still a very unknown brand in the US of what I've just described. Personally, driving up, was it in Dallas, I think in October, onto a gas station with an Aston, a DBS. At the pump, and people come around and they admire the beauty of the car, but they have no clue who we are. You're only cool, or you're only selling cars in terms of what they stand for, the status and the power of the status it represents, if your broader social context appreciates on who you are as a brand and what that car actually is, right? Yeah. So that we're still lacking in the US. And for us, there's tremendous opportunity still in the US to capture much more of the market. Despite all the growth and all the economic news of it's all happening over in the Far East, it's not only. Of course, the Far East is very important for us. And in terms of finding foot particularly on distribution and brand development, that goes at a very rapid pace. And I'm convinced that in the next 5 years, we'll probably see an equal volume coming out of the Far East, including China, as we see now of the UK or the US, for instance.
Yeah.
But so strategic growth markets, China, very important for us, of course, but equally, no, the US hasn't gone out of breath, not at all. There's a lot to gain for us still there.
Yeah. So
anything out of the UK, essentially, for us is still a lot to gain.
That's right. So an expanding brand in a sort of a mature market is still a big opportunity for you. There's
very
no
much
question.
big opportunity, big challenge, of course, in an established market.
Yeah.
But big opportunity. Yes.
If we can just talk about China and go to where the hype is, just for a moment. What, with your experience, you're obviously being global marketing director, is your experience in China in terms of doing business well in China? Another big question, but just from your experience, I mean, I know that Dr. Jurek Bez, your CEO, spends quite a lot of time out there. Is that important? And is there any other lessons you think that you've learned so far about doing business well in China?
Yeah, China's everywhere else. I think if there's one key to take away, it's find the key ingredient to translate, and that crosses and transcends geographical distances and cultures as well. There are a few, and if you have them in your brand core, I think you're very well off. For us, it's passion. Clearly, the passion in automotive and the passion in racing, the passion in beautiful cars. It's a common denominator, and friends and colleagues in China share this just as much as someone in the US will share it or someone here in the UK. And you start to model around that. Now, the value sets these people bring to the table, different consumers, different minds, different tastes, is critically important. So, of course, we have a brand model that we developed that at the core captures the essence, but allows itself to lend and take into account cultural sensitivities and contexts. And we're doing exactly that, to tailor that, to fine-tune, shall I say, that brand model and how we translate which values. History, for instance, and luxury over racing credentials. In the UK or continental Europe, racing credentials is incredibly important because it builds performance credentials for our road cars. In China, luxury craftsmanship and the notion of, wow, British brand, 100 years old, is probably more powerful.
The economy, we're still unfortunately in a slightly protracted downturn, and hopefully I'd love to stop asking questions about how to manage in a downturn because it's getting a little bit boring asking those questions. But in terms of the economic downturn, has it had a big impact on Aston Martin? Are people buying fewer cars because of the downturn? Or I see in the news you're doing remarkably well, so it doesn't seem like that's the case, but love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, well, firstly, we're a very small niche, a high exclusive, high-end car manufacturer. And we're talking about 4,500, 5,000 cars a year here. Yeah. So it is very, very small in the grander scheme of things of automotive globally. And secondly, for instance, I'll give you an example. We've built a supercar, the 177. It's a fantastic piece of car. It sells, or it goes in the UK at about £1.2 million. And we've sold them out. So that really demonstrates that there is, always has been, and will be a place for supercars in the hearts and minds of customers out there. Yeah. So we're okay. We're okay.
Excellent. Good place to be.
Yes.
And do you find it with, we interviewed Andy Kostler, who owns the Intercontinental Hotel group. Well, he doesn't own it, but he's the CEO. He was the former CEO of the group. And he says it's good to have products, multiple brands in your product portfolio. So you've got one that's extreme luxury, like the supercar, so that if it's a really good economy, people can buy that. And then you've got other categories, and people can go up and down based on how affluent people feel. Is there a sort of is there not a cheaper version of an Aston, but a less expensive? I guess what I'm trying to say, like Porsche Boxster, you could argue, is a less expensive Porsche. Is that a strategy you think? Or?
Well, I definitely agree that depending on the nature of business and industry you're in, that's a great strategy to have, to sort of build entry-level points and positions and feeding models for repeat purchase and loyalty. But not really our world.
And in terms of operating in a downturn, you mentioned right at the beginning, Aston doesn't discount per se. I mean, it's not the Aston brand to see 2-for-1 offers and things like that. But what lessons have you learned from your success in this economic downturn?
I think be more diligent and look at efficiency of spend, particularly when it comes to marketing. The models that you have to measure your success become even more important. Many luxury brands, I would say, have probably been in a world where economy the economy was such that demand constantly outstripped supply. And when that started to break in about 2007 and 8, the models behind the scenes that FMCG companies will have had already in place to measure and track return on investment had to be built in many of these companies, and that includes us. Right. We're now in a really good position where we are extremely clear on efficiencies and returns before we spend money on marketing or brand activities. Yeah. And I think that for us is the key to make sure we continue spending and investing into the brand, but in the most diligent and effective way possible.
Brilliant.
Everything else would harm or damage us. We don't do 2 for 1 type of thing.
You're in a competitive market. You've got a very, very strong position in that competitive market, but you're in a competitive market. So from your experience over at Harley-Davidson and now with Aston Martin, what is the key to maintaining and keeping a strong competitive advantage?
It's understanding your customers, but not just from a figures data perspective. And particularly in our market, and with Harley was the same, you really have to be and spend time at the front line, at events, in dealerships. You've got to intrinsically feel and understand who these people are and why they buy your product and your brand. And all of a sudden you start to realize, and with Harley it's the same, and with Aston it's no different. Yes, I can list you 5 competitive brands and models on each, but really those 2 brands stand in its own right almost. It's for the majority, if someone buys an Aston, and the same is true for Harley, they actually have made their choice at the brand level upfront. Why? Because they really look for the intrinsic values of what these brands have to offer. The model is almost a second choice, or it's a repeat purchase. So I think the answer to the question, to keep it relatively short, is really understand who you are as a brand and the values intrinsically, not just what you do and your CI and your marcoms, but who really are you, what are real values behind it. And secondly, how does this connect with your target audience and with your customers? And I think only then do you start to look at, okay, how do we differentiate in the competitive set? Okay, fine, there are competitors, but if you really have that crystal clear, all of a sudden your competitive set isn't just, in our instance, Bentleys, Porsches, Maseratis, Ferraris, but it's actually the luxury spectrum as a whole, because most of our customers, I would say probably all of them, live in multiple dimensions of consuming luxury goods for the sake of good taste. Right. And all of a sudden it's much broader. It's yachts, it's holidays, it's jets, it's you name it. It's not just the 5-6 top competitive brands.
It's really interesting that when I asked you that question, one of the first things you said is get out there with your customer and understand your customer, because it's a mantra that's so timeless and true. I was speaking to a marketing director the other day of a company I won't mention, but I asked her, when was the last time you spent time with the market? And she hadn't spent time with the market face to face for about 3 or 4 years. So really good. Oh, no names.
Sure.
So it's a really, really good point. And there's increasingly a lot of CEOs seem to be spending chunks of time with the front line, which is great. Talking about CEOs, you've worked with Dr. Jörg Bez, obviously, the CEO of Aston Martin. Is there any leadership lessons? Well, actually, rather than ask you that, I'd just like to ask from your perspective, what leadership lessons have you learned? You're running a global team. What leadership lessons have you picked up along the way? If you could share one piece of advice.
I'm still learning. I'm still learning. Like every good marketeer probably would say, I'm still learning. It's a constant question of adaptation, both to external and internal circumstances. But if there's one that I've taken away is honesty and integrity, and just be crystal clear in what you do. And our CEO in that aspect, I must say, is really great. He's not only extremely passionate, he's also a demonstration of true integrity, and it filters through the entire organization. It's not as easy as it sounds to cope with and to live with. And very often, particularly from a marketeer standpoint of view, in an engineering and product-driven organization. But if you boil it down to what does this actually mean in terms of core values that the brand represents, it's great, because it's quite black and white, right? It allows you to be not only crystal clear and free of politics, but also to turn decisions relatively quickly around, because there isn't lots of politics and big hierarchies. And
we're upstairs with a whole sort of some of the UK's top CMOs, chief marketing officers. What are some of the issues that you think the CMOs are really facing today? What are sort of top 1 or 2 things that you and other CMOs are really facing, sort of tackling?
Yeah, a good question. Again, I'd probably name 2. One is still the eternal demonstrate your return. You know, how's that investment into your fluffy marketing proposal going to help us sell more of our products and ultimately affect the bottom line? So measurability and accountability are still from what I hear upstairs and for us as well, are absolute key. However, where this was a science in its own, and it still is in nascent stages to some extent, it's become more of a given. We expect that, and the board expects it, and everyone working with you kind of expects your ability to demonstrate through metrics of how you perform and how you do. The second one, and that's ongoing and it won't go away. In the country with more data, more of it will actually become transparent and more has to be justified, I think. The second one is a more soft one, and that's to do with everyone's a marketeer. Everyone's a marketeer, particularly when times are tough and resources are scarce. All of a sudden, everyone has an opinion and everyone's a marketeer. And to bring this onto one table and not just play the service department and facilitator, but actually the one that says, here's the voice of the customer and we drive the customer-centric agenda in this business is tricky, not just for myself, I admit, like for everyone in a marketing position at the senior level, I'm sure that's equivalent, but to your question, what I hear from upstairs, from what's being debated as well.
Right, right. How do you go about incorporating the voice of the customer into innovation, for example? I mean, you know, in a lot of organizations, you put products into the marketplace and then there's feedback as opposed to the customer actually innovating on your behalf. I suppose it's quite over Aston Martin, it's not like customers can give feedback as to what the design of your car should look like, I'm imagining. So, but how do you incorporate in that with the customer voice?
Two elements to it. One is quantitative, and we've built it and we have it, of course, customer satisfaction measurement at the point of purchase, earlier in the purchase funnel, all the way through to usage and driving the car and after sales and repeat purchase. It's the quant stuff. Where I would say we take the most inspiration from, you get product feedback as part of the quant measurable journey, so to speak. But the quantitative engagement for us is incredibly important because we're so small. Very often our feedback comes from face-to-face interaction, driving cars with our customers on ice or on a track or in a couple of weeks over in Austria on a more of a lifestyle tour. We're so close to our customers, or we invite them to a round table and say, come and have dinner with us. Talk to our chief designer, our chief executive, our chief engineer, and tell us what you think. And it's literally in these conversations that we take a lot out of it. So those are 2 points where I think we measure both scientifically and more non-scientifically, but equally important. Yeah. And thirdly, it's having a really clear vision and opinion of, again, who we are. So some of it we listen to and some of it we just ignore. Yeah. We're not the brand for everyone. You have to be really clear. If you're too tall or too diplomatically, fat is the word, but if you don't fit in our cars, it's tough stuff. We don't build cars to suit every person on this planet.
That's right, absolutely. Brilliant. I wanted to ask you, just as you've been speaking today, you shared a lot of wisdom with us, Markus, and I remember doing some research on you, and I understand you started out as an architect. So I'm hearing all these pearls of wisdom on business and marketing and leadership, and then I'm thinking you're an architect. So I'm getting originally an architect. So how did an architect basically end up doing what you're doing now?
How does this come? Yeah. Good question as well. Okay, yes, I did start out in architecture, absolutely so. I enjoyed the balance of planning and implementation and this constant, you plan, but you go out on a construction site and you see taking the whole thing shape, a house, a factory, whatever it is, you name it. The creative sides of it, the science of materials and ingredients and the integration of multiple stakeholders to build one piece of a house, for instance, whatever it was, spec'd to the customer's requirements. Wasn't commercial enough for me, so after about 4 years I've decided to call it a day and go a more commercial route. And that's where I thought marketing is great, because it's not just a house that you leave behind, but you architect business structures, for instance, customer satisfaction, for my opinion. This isn't just, for us it sits in marketing. Customer satisfaction, how you measure it, underlying systems, infrastructures you build, customer relationship management, a digital strategy. Those are all planning stages that you plan, carefully architect, and then bring into fruition for something that then lives on, as in an organic structure such as a business. And so I found that very, very enjoyable.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've heard today it's like you've been talking both, because a lot of marketing and CMOs are, I think, getting maybe lost in the science of marketing, because there's so much data and there's so much things you can measure now. But as you've said, going out for dinners with your customers, ultimately that falls under marketing too. You obviously...
It does, absolutely does. Yeah. It's probably, if I had to choose between the two of them, I'd probably take that. Depending on where you are, but for our brand, I chose that, the art over the science, probably.
Markus, that's beautiful, and I just want to say you've shared some amazing pearls of wisdom with us today, all the way from your strategy in the US, China, how to build a brand, and we just want to say thank you so very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Anthony. My pleasure.